Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I am Brian Griffith, and today we are covering the unfolding, what appears to be a right-wing coup attempt in Venezuela. For those who have followed this, Venezuela has been under intense international pressure, especially kind of coup attempts and various attempts to destabilize and overthrow the Venezuelan government for a very long time. But specifically, this is ramped up since about mid-2017 or so. The latest, which is breaking kind of as we speak, unfolding by the day, is that there has been from what I understand, a rather minor, not very well-known politician by the name of Juan Guaidó, who has declared himself to be the legitimate president of Venezuela. He did not participate in the last elections, but he is now declaring these elections to be legitimate and has declared himself president, at which point he began issuing edicts as though he were the president to Venezuelan officials, Venezuelan military or whatnot, expecting support from the Venezuelan military. At the same time, or just days before, rather, essentially happening almost simultaneously, there was a mutiny by a couple dozen people within the Venezuelan military, an attempted mutiny that was kind of caught and, stopped, nipped in the bud there. So this is an incredibly harrowing time for the Venezuelan government as this U.S. right-wing coup unfolds, and as many of the countries within the Americas, especially those aligned with the U.S., have declared essentially this puppet president, Juan Guaidó, to be the legitimate president of Venezuela, not recognizing the legitimacy anymore of the democratically elected Maduro government. Joining us to talk about all this from Venezuela is Paul Dobson, who is one of the editors of Venezuelanalysis. Thank you, Paul, for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Brian.
I'm wondering if you can give us sort of a rundown of how things have unfolded there and what the kind of situation on the ground is at the moment.
Yes, well, as you explained in your introduction, basically yesterday was a very historic day in Venezuela. It's the commemoration of the overthrow of the dictatorship in 1958. It's a day when historically Venezuelans take to the streets supporting democracy in the name of democracy. So yesterday, as is usual, the pro-government supporters, the Chavistas, as they're called here, took to the streets in a massive protest demonstration rally in Caracas. The opposition supporters did the same in Caracas in a sizable or a similar mobilization of both political forces in the country. And at the opposition gathering, the president of the National Assembly, which is effectively the Senate or the Congress here, declared himself to be president, which is quite ludicrous, to be fair. Following this, in a very clearly orchestrated series of events, the White House came out recognizing him to be the legitimate president of Venezuela. Seconds later, all of the North American allies in the region, starting with Canada, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and so on, followed suit. Since then, Juan Guaidó has disappeared. We haven't seen him. There are rumors, unconfirmed rumors, I should add, that he is holed up in an embassy. The government then quickly came out and talked to its multitude of followers in Caracas, taking a series of measures. They threw out the American diplomatic mission in Venezuela, broke off diplomatic ties, and gave them 72 hours to leave the country. They called this an attempted coup d'etat. And Nicolas Maduro called for calm. He called for peace. He called for his supporters to not do anything crazy. He's very clear that he is the only legitimate president of Venezuela. He was the only man who was voted by the Venezuelans to assume the presidency. And as such, he's a man to rule the country. Following that, a series of other governments across the region have recognized Juan Guaidó, mostly right-wing American following governments. In the other camp, important countries such as Russia, Portugal, Spain, Mexico have all come out saying effectively, what's this? We can't impose a man. Maduro was elected by the president, and so he's the president. We're going to carry on having relations with him. And so this is basically the state of affairs. There were a few pockets of isolated violence last night, mostly instigated by the right-wing agitators who are taking to the streets in a violent manner to defend, I guess, what they consider to be the claim of their man to the presidency. There have been around 20 deaths reported so far, which is obviously very regrettable, and we're hoping that this figure does not increase. There are pro-government vigils have been set up around important government offices across the country, including the presidential palace itself. But this morning things are a lot calmer. It seems there are no reported violent incidents so far today. And we're waiting to see if President Maduro speaks again to the country, or if his competitor Juan Guaidó appears from wherever he is and addresses his followers.
So Juan Guaidó is the kind of leader of the at this point, pretty much disgraced National Assembly, which, has been kind of held in contempt of the government for quite some time for essentially, allegations of, among other things, corruption and vote buying. It is not kind of functioning organism of the government. And beyond that, Juan Guaidó did not run for president. How much name recognition does he have? How much real kind of support would someone like him have? Who is Juan Guaidó, and why might he, rather than one of the other opposition leaders who such as Falcon, and this is not to legitimize this because, again, Maduro was elected as president in one of the most kind of widely watched and, closely certified elections in the world right now. There are thousands of international observers who watch the Venezuelan elections and who found no evidence of there being kind of voter fraud or otherwise voter suppression. I just want to wonder why kind of Juan Guaidó, out of other kind of more well-known, all of these being right-wing opposition figures.
Well, you probably know as much about this person as I do. He's only just appeared on the political scene here. No one had heard his name until 2 weeks ago. A recent poll last week of Venezuelans suggested that 81% of normal Venezuelans don't recognize his name. 81%. Basically, Juan Guaidó comes from a far-right party called Popular Will, which is better known for being the party of Leopoldo López, who was the man who instigated the street violence in 2014 and is currently serving time behind bars for his role in that. Juan Guaidó is not the leader of this party. He is just a member. He was elected a member of parliament some years ago, a deputy, and on the 5th of January, within this National Assembly body, which had been declared defunct by the Supreme Court because of its lack of will to adhere to the constitutionality of the country. So the National Assembly, in its character of being illegitimate at this moment, legally illegitimate, took a vote and elected him to be their president, the Speaker of the House, or the President of the House, if you like. He then obviously used this position to push for a coup d'etat, taking off the executive power, the presidency of the Republic. Now, it's interesting to point out that there's been a long-term division within the Venezuelan opposition between essentially those who think they should stick to democratic legal methods to try to win power, and those who say that they will never win power that way, therefore they should adhere to extra democratic or extra legal measures. Juan Guaidó very definitely falls into the second of these camps. But the relationship which he has with the first sector, including people like Henry Falcon, who legitimately ran in the presidential elections, lost, but tried and democratically failed. So the relationship which Juan Guaidó is having with these sectors is not clear at this moment. There is tepid support from these people to Juan Guaidó's claim, but it's very tepid. And the large machinery of the big opposition parties, which mostly are democratic parties, is yet to be fully mobilized behind him.
So then this is, it's not yet clear sort of what kind of stance Juan Guaidó will take and what sort of support he will have between the two kind of wings of the right-wing opposition that is kind of gunning for national elections versus those kind of more aligned with Leopoldo Lopez that have, taken to more kind of kind of contra style warfare in the streets. It's not clear then, how Juan Guaidó is kind of courting these two camps.
Exactly. And in terms of the opposition activists or the anti-Chavista activists, your average people in the streets who don't agree with the government policies, at this stage, they don't really care. They've suffered 20 years of defeat and false promises from a whole range of leaders, both democratic leaders such as Enrique Capriles, who promised them that the time was now in 2013 and lost, and also ex-democratic leaders like Leopoldo Lopez, who also promised them the time was now, and that also failed. So at this point, the opposition activists are willing to accept anybody who just gets the job done. They don't need for this person to be a particularly good politician, a particularly well-known politician. They don't even care about what sort of policies he's going to bring in afterwards. They're just willing to see anybody who can get Maduro out of the presidential palace, and a lot of them will give their backing to this person regardless.
I'd like to also comment a little bit, just to sort of point out just how incredibly facetious this entire thing is, and how incredibly outrageous this would be if, for instance, to kind of use a comparison within the U.S., if some kind of minor political figure, someone who had only been elected, to a minor kind of political body somewhere, had suddenly declared themselves president of the United States, began issuing edicts on behalf of the government of the United States, essentially began issuing edicts to the military, telling the military what to do, telling U.S. diplomats around the world what they need to be doing, issuing orders as though they were the executive branch. If someone were to do that and then all of a sudden say Russia and China and Venezuela and North Korea and all the other countries that the U.S. finds so scary, if those countries then all of a sudden within hours had recognized the so-called quote unquote legitimacy of that person as the president, that would be seen as a blatant violation of the sovereignty of the United States, whatever quote unquote democracy might actually exist in the United States. But in this scenario, that would be recognized as an absolute blatant attack on any sort of sovereignty, and yet that happens in Venezuela, and there's it's not being reported as such. This is such a blatant attempt to impose a leader who, again, was not only was he not elected, he did not even run for president, and is now declaring himself president. So I'd like to turn to kind of the nature of the protests and the just general class character of the different groups. So right now, the opposition has had more or less a roughly 30% support among the people. That is to say that, they have a 30% favorable approval rating by and large from the latest kind of statistic I saw. They are widely hated among most of the populace because of the events of 2017, the attempted drone strike assassination of Maduro in 2018, because of the destabilization efforts that they have undertaken in Venezuela. They have lost so much popularity, and for given that they were divided in the 2018 elections between a boycott of elections, which they were widely expected to lose, and which they did lose, and between the part of the opposition aligned with Falcón, who decided to participate in the elections. They're kind of split right now, but they're also widely unpopular. That kind of being said, from the anti-Maduro protests I have seen, the kind of population that shows up, the demographic that shows up to these anti-Maduro protests tends to be overwhelmingly kind of light-skinned, just generally kind of, I don't want to say affluent looking, because it's hard to tell what affluent looking means in the street, but generally comfortable looking people, as opposed to when you see the pro-government, the pro-Maduro, essentially the coalition around Chavismo, it's very kind of visibly and audibly a more working class movement. They're far more kind of darker skinned people. There's a more kind of variety of just variety of body types associated with like kind of impoverished people, and you can tell that these. Looking at kind of the pro-Chavismo forces tend to be from a more kind of working class background. I'm wondering what the kind of class character of these is, whether Chavismo kind of retains that popular support in the face of, at this point, several years of intense economic sanctions that have blocked have blocked, for instance, the importation of insulin, among other life-saving drugs. So essentially, it's been economic warfare against this country to try and break up this Chavista coalition to kind of pit the working class against Chavismo. So I'm wondering whether that has actually had what kind of effect that might have had on the kind of resolve of the Venezuelan people to fight U.S. imperialism, and also what sort of the class character of the military is in this, because I know that the military has kind of had this dual class character that is various factions at various points in Venezuelan history have been aligned with different forces.
Yeah, well, so a lot of points there. Just before we talk about the class nature of the two opposing blocs, I just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned there. If somebody stood up in the U.S. Congress and declared themselves president, or if Hillary Clinton, who actually got more votes than Donald Trump, if she stood up in the Congress and said, well, I'm going to be president now, what would happen to this person, Brian? Would they be arrested?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so that would be a normal application of justice in a standard country. I don't know what's going to happen to Juan Guaidó here, but there are speculations that at some point he may be arrested. He's committed a crime, and I think it's important to take this into account. No, for your followers who enjoy social media, I would encourage you to check out the hashtag Me Declaro, which in Spanish is a translation of "I declare myself." Venezuelans with a typical black humor were enjoying this yesterday on social media. People declaring themselves president of the beer company, people declaring themselves president of the mango trees, and a whole range of other facetious tweets, basically mocking the self-declaration of this upstart deputy. So moving on to your question now about the nature, it's important to remember that Venezuela is going through a deep economic recession. This economic recession has to some extent broken down these traditional divisions between pro-government and anti-government supporters, to the extent that a lot of pro-government supporters now would consider themselves middle ground, probably wouldn't vote for the opposition, but would probably not come out and vote for the government either, because let's be clear, the government, the people who lead the economy, and the economy here in Venezuela is a disaster. Now we can discuss why it's a disaster. Sanctions has a very important part to play in this, but also things like corruption, bad decision making, perhaps mismanagement, brain drain, a whole cocktail of different factors, for some of which the government have to accept responsibility for, and they do. But these sort of economic issues which Venezuelans are living through, which I live through here in Venezuela, hyperinflation is a key one, for example, have obviously diminished to some extent the support for the government. But this is not to say that the opposition now currently have a majority of support amongst the population. The recent polls, recent elections show this very clearly. Even if you presume those who decided not to vote in last year's election, those who abstained, would have voted for an opposition candidate, which is something which we can't necessarily assume with all certainty. But let's assume that they still wouldn't have won the elections. So it's very difficult to tell, but what I think is important to remember is that for your average working class Venezuelan who maybe doesn't feel motivated to come out and support Chavismo anymore, I understand this, and I think it's important we do understand this. The day-to-day life in Venezuela is very difficult at the moment to get by. And the enthusiasm which people felt for a national project of liberation, started by Hugo Chavez, is difficult to continue in these conditions. But that said, history has shown that a foreign threat, which Mr. Trump is very idly supplying to Mr. Maduro, galvanizes and regroups the popular forces around the government. This is exactly what happened in April and May, when we were in electoral campaigning period. The sanctions announced by the White House basically pushed the patriotic forces back into Mr. Maduro's camp perfectly, allowing him to play the patriotic card very effectively, and to some extent was counterproductive politically. No? We can expect a similar response or a similar reaction at the moment. In fact, we've already started seeing numerous factors, let's say, on the fringe of the ruling party, the allied parties with them, or some to the slightly to the left or to the right of the government, but who consider themselves patriotic, have put aside their qualms with certain government economic policies which they disagree with, and are currently standing side by side with the government forces in defense of the country. So this is one of the political effects which Juan Guaido's actions has had on the country. It's actually managed to unify the Chavista forces even more so. For those who believe that this U.S. coup attempt would eliminate any of the, obviously existing corruption problems within the Venezuelan government, I think that's an absolutely absurd point to make. If you look at any other U.S. coup in history, if you look at any other similar scenario in history, I mean, obviously the forces here that are opposing Chavismo in this attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government are from the far right wing, are from the capitalist restoration wing. Not that Venezuela is entirely a socialist state. It's got kind of that mixed economy there that has been moving more toward kind of a social democratic or a democratic socialist model, from my understanding, depending on how you'd like to categorize that. But it's if you look at the actual right wing opposition, if you look at the actual opposition, this is certainly a far right wing capitalist restoration project, an imperialist restoration project. One of the big kind of strategies of the 2017 attacks, the essentially 2017 coup attempt in Venezuela, one of the strategies there was essentially to wait to provoke, the Venezuelan military to respond, knowing that the U.S. media would cover things in a certain way. So I think Abby Martin with the Empire Files really revealed this in a way that no other kind of journalist could, or few other journalists could, by getting access to one of the one of the kind of Venezuelan opposition groups as they went and essentially committed like street violence as they launched a violent campaign against the Venezuelan government and Venezuelan military. She was able to get footage kind of showing the two-faced character of that particular opposition, of that particular kind of insurgency strategy, where essentially these Venezuelan rioters would tell her, only show the good things we do, only show the or only show the government response to us, don't show what we do to the government. In fact, they were they were violently attacking like a military outpost at the point. They were engaging in the guarimbas, essentially flaming barricades that were blocking the streets of Caracas with fire, just giant flaming barricades, and they would go and attack this military installation and wait for that military response or the government response or police response, and then show that as a sort of as the quote unquote proof that Maduro was cracking down on dissent, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder how much of that we're seeing here, where essentially this is possibly, I guess a bluff isn't the right word, but in fact that perhaps Juan Guaido, the kind of the puppet president who's now in hiding, how much he's sort of relying on this kind of media manipulation. Yeah, I think this is a very important element to talk about. Juan Guaidó hasn't publicly encouraged any of these sort of violent protests. He's mostly watching his back, because the last man who publicly encouraged these sort of violent protests is currently serving time, which is his party leader, Leopoldo Lopez. At the moment, we have seen but very isolated, very small pockets of these guarimbas, these violent street protests. I can't overemphasize this. Not even 1% of the municipalities across the country currently have these sort of security issues going on. And just for your listeners, it's very important to remember this. When there's a group of 10 masked citizens throwing Molotov cocktails at a public building, at a nursery, at a bus station, and then the police come in and use tear gas to protect the building and push these protesters back. Is this a excessive force, or is this a standard procedure you would see in pretty much any country in the world to protect the public buildings? If some of these protesters throwing Molotov cocktails or firing guns are then arrested for firing upon a military man or a policeman, is this excessive use of force? Is this a political prisoner, or is this somebody who has committed a crime under Venezuelan law and is going to face trial for his actions or her actions? No. Again, it's often interesting to look at the other side of the coin. If yourself, Brian, if you picked up a Molotov cocktail and you went to a ministry or the State Department in Washington and you threw this Molotov cocktail against the State Department, what would happen to you? Who would come out saying Brian is a political prisoner? Nobody. No. So we have to apply the same standards that you would apply at home to Venezuela, I think.
Yeah, and kind of also on that point, other kind of targets they were targeting during this, this is during the 2017 violence. Obviously, it's a slightly different scenario now, but it's kind of the same balance of forces within the opposition. They were firebombing food warehouses. They were lynching. They lynched a black man. They burned him in the street. Orlando Figueroa was lynched and burned in the street as
just to stop you there, Brian, there are unconfirmed reports, and again, I'll stress it's unconfirmed, I can't confirm this, that in fact in the area of the country which I am, there was a very similar incident late last night of a man being burnt alive. I hope I don't get this information confirmed, but I suspect that I will do at some point through today.
Yeah, that's very disturbing. So, we have a couple minutes left. I'm wondering what else you might have seen or kind of observed from being in Venezuela that, might be important for U.S. listeners to know and understand.
Well, I think one of the things which struck us yesterday, actually, were the journalists, myself, who are reporting on this, is, the opposition have been looking for this sort of scenario for 20 years. According to them, they now have their president, and no one else recognizes him. But and so we expected them to come out and celebrate. But there were no celebrations. No, there were no people on the streets celebrating what would be a political coup for them. No, what there were a few opposition people throwing stones and very angrily trying to cause chaos and destruction. Now, this isn't necessarily the behavior of a political force that believes it has won a victory. This is a behavior of a political force which recognize the weakness of their so-called leader and feel that they have to defend him at the point of stones and Molotov cocktails. So I think this in itself is a recognition of the very, very weak position which Juan Guaidó is in at the moment. He has no control over the Venezuelan institutions. He has no control over the Venezuelan diplomatic corps. He has no control over the Venezuelan armed forces. And most importantly, potentially, he has no control over the Venezuelan oil industry. No? So without these four pillars, I really see how it's going to be very difficult for him, even if he were able to occupy the presidential palace somehow, to actually exercise the rule of law or government in the country.
Yeah, that's real important to notice. We are going to have to leave it there for now. We've been talking with Paul Dobson, who's a contributor and an editor with Venezuelanalysis, about the unfolding coup attempt in Venezuela and kind of the state of affairs now. Thank you, Paul, very much for coming on.
My pleasure, Brian.
Now we turn to another new segment we are starting. If you haven't figured out, we are going to kind of a monthly segment model where we're, trying to have more kind of recurring guests to, keep people updated on various kind of facets of social and economic justice. So we're very happy to be joined for this segment on survivor justice by Kristen Lenau, who is an organizer with the Survivor Justice Project based in Austin. Thank you very much, Kristen, for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you brought quite a bit to our attention with this month's segment. There's a lot of really obviously for those who have followed the show, there's a lot going on kind of in Austin and around Austin with regard to the kind of rape clearance scandals and other kind of scandals around rape and sexual assault that have played out through the course of at least several years, but obviously these are systemic problems going back a long time. So let's get into the first article. This comes from Newsy. This is an article: Audit finds Austin Police Department improperly cleared rape cases. And when we last covered this, the APD was just beginning to send these rape kits to DPS, or essentially, trying to ask the Texas Department of Public Safety to examine and kind of re-examine their work and determine what kind of wrongdoings had happened. So, what kind of were the results of this?
Yeah, so we saw the report, the fuller report, come out from DPS about a week ago. Chief Manley gave a press conference just updating the community on what that looks like for them. And what essentially they found was that over a third of the cases that they audited during a 3-month time period were improperly coded and classified by the department. So the department was exceptionally clearing cases that they did not meet the criteria to correctly clear that way. So the department pointed out each case and individually what elements were missing from those criteria that needed to be there in order for them to be considered exceptionally cleared under UCR guidelines.
So it looks like this, the audit from DPS looked at 95 sexual assault cases, specifically from January, November, and December of 2017 that had been exceptionally cleared. It found that 30 rape offenses were exceptionally cleared that did not meet the criteria for exceptional clearances.
Right.
This, even according to DPS, which nobody was expecting a whole lot out of, said that only 25 were properly classified. I think that's really telling as to what sort of systemic issue we have.
It was. I mean, it was disturbing, as an advocate. We knew that there were issues, and we knew that the issues go deeper than just these clearances. But even on a surface level, for there to be that many problems come to light was somewhat surprising, given that they only looked at a 3-month time period. I mean, we had heard from retired Sergeant Liz Donegan that this was a problem, so we, on some level, were expecting it. But I think the sheer numbers were still a bit of a shock to people.
Yeah. So with the February 15th deadline coming up to report the city's official crime numbers for 2018, given that it seems that in many ways Manley, that is Austin Police Chief Brian Manley, is kind of doubling down on essentially saying that, that his department didn't do anything wrong intentionally. He called it a quote unquote difference of opinions with Donegan, who said she was essentially ordered to misclassify these. It seems like in many ways the APD is gearing up to sort of double down on having done nothing wrong intentionally, and simply using this as an kind of opportunity to quote unquote retrain the officers. But I wonder, how much we can actually expect either out of that retraining process or out of whether they'll be properly classifying these in the near future with the February 15th deadline.
Well, there's a big thing that we're advocating for right now. A conversation that we started having even before we learned about the DPS audit was wanting a comprehensive, independent evaluation of how sexual assault cases are being handled by APD. And so we know that there's a lot of dedicated folks on the ground that are doing the best that they can to work these cases. And what we'd like to see is a non-governmental entity that is selected with input from survivors, selected with input from advocates and community members, come in and evaluate the unit, evaluate their practices in cases going back several years, and then offer them training and recommendations that the city can go ahead and implement. So that's taking the form of a resolution that's going to be coming up in front of Austin City Council on January 31st. And it is authored by Allison Alter, and there are several co-sponsors as well. So that's something that our organization is really pushing hard for right now.
And if people are interested in, learning more about that process to get this resolution through, or would like to know how they can you support that, where can they find more information?
Yeah, so we have an event posted on our Facebook page. So Survivor Justice Project is on Facebook, and we have an event that's there. So it talks about the details of the resolution. It talks about the co-sponsors. We have Councilmember Garza, Councilmember Czar, Councilmember Kitchen, and the mayor have signed on as co-sponsors. We hope to see the resolution become public by the end of this week. And what we're encouraging people to do is to call or email or visit with their individual council members and ask them questions, encourage them to support this resolution when it comes up next week.
As much as this is often portrayed as having been something that's either come from the top down or otherwise been exposed by, reporters with Newsy and these other organizations such as ProPublica, the truth is so much of this has happened from so much of kind of the pressure on local police departments to get things right, to fix these problems, has come from the work of grassroots local organizers who are kind of constantly on the scene, who are constantly sort of doing their best to sort of agitate and organize for some sort of real justice. And this kind of then filters back up into sort of the journalistic realm where it then becomes more visible because of the work of those local organizers, or at least that's kind of how I've seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a trend across the country. And, we're in a privileged position where we can, engage with council. We can call these things out and we can talk about them in a public sphere, whereas a lot of people that are still in the field and they're doing the work, maybe they're not in that position. And so we like to use that opportunity to organize, to provide people a platform, provide survivors a platform, and ensure that council feels educated on the subject and that we're ensuring that we're advocating for the best practices here locally.
You also brought 3 other articles, to our segment this week. I'm sorry that we're not going to really have a chance to get into all of those, but I was wondering if you had one in particular that you thought might stand out enough to really kind of warrant a larger discussion in our last few minutes.
Let's see. I think there's even been a new one since we talked from ProPublica that talks about the resolution. So Mark Greenblatt did extended coverage on the press conference from Austin Police Department last week and talked about the resolution from Councilmember Alter, as well as some of the nuances that came out of that press conference in relation to their reporting, in relation to the data. So I think if people really want to get into the weeds, or if they want to learn more about the resolution and how they can get involved, that's a good source.
Okay, yeah, we will try to post a link to that on the Spreaker link when we put it up on Spreaker, when we put it up on SoundCloud. People will have access to what we talked about today. I would definitely recommend kind of checking out all of this. It's really so important to kind of read deeper into this. It's so important to not just
it's nuanced, that's for sure.
Yeah. So is there anything else in our last couple of minutes that you feel kind of needs mentioning? Again, I'd like to apologize to you and to to our listeners for kind of having to cut this short. I had some scheduling issues. So if there's anything else,
no, not at all. Well, I think we really just want to keep pushing for some culture change here in the city. We're really encouraged when we heard Chief Manley come out and say that they were open to a third-party evaluation. We took that with great heart and encouragement, because that's the kind of attitude that it's going to take in order for real change to happen. So now we just want to see the community become engaged in this process. criminal justice processes, criminal justice system shouldn't be so inaccessible to people. It shouldn't be so difficult to access, and it shouldn't be so hard to understand. And so part of what we like to do at Survivor Justice Project is ensuring that not only people have a voice, but they understand the issue and they understand what they're asking for and advocating for. So that's really what we're looking for is culture change.
We've been talking with Kristen Lenau of the Survivor Justice Project based here in Austin. The Survivor Justice Project does all sorts of great advocacy for survivors. We're going to keep this going as a monthly segment to talk about various survivor justice news, people's movements to put an end to kind of patriarchal oppression, sexual assault, and, to find justice for all survivors in whatever form that means. Thank you, Kristen, very much for coming on, and we'll talk again next month.
Great. Thank you so much for your continued attention on this.
So typically, this is going to be a half-hour segment with Kristen Lenau or someone else from the Survivor Justice Project. I apologize for having to cut this interview short due to a scheduling error on my part. Going forward, it's going to be a half-hour segment every month featuring all news about survivor justice. So to finish out our show, I would like to follow up on a story that we covered recently, and this is the push for reproductive rights and reproductive justice in New Mexico. This is from the Party for Socialism and Liberation's Albuquerque branch's forum that happened about a month ago, around the time that we also had an organizer, Candace Yanis, on from that branch. So this is a kind of continuation of that discussion, and we will keep the conversation going around reproductive rights as things develop, as we do with so much else. Thanks for kind of bearing with us as we sort of reconfigure a lot of the show in early 2019 to be more about these kind of regular segments, because I believe it's important that we always have that follow-up, that we don't let things simply be kind of a one and done deal, but in fact that we continue following the same stories as they evolve, and as the kind of struggle progresses toward some sort of justice. So without further ado, this is from the PSL Albuquerque branch's recent forum on the struggle to legalize abortion in New Mexico.
So this evening I will be speaking about the Party for Socialism and Liberation's campaign to repeal New Mexico's antiquated abortion ban. I will be speaking about what this abortion ban is, what this campaign entails, and go over the political significance of this issue around abortion rights, as well as the significance of this campaign in general. So what is this ban that I am speaking of? That very question arises all the time, actually, when our petitioners meet New Mexicans who are very enthusiastic to sign the petition to protect abortion access, but weren't aware that such a ban exists. But yes, there is an abortion ban in New Mexico. New Mexico has a 50-year-old law on its books banning abortion in almost all cases. The only thing keeping it from being enforced is the 1973 Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. But now with the confirmation of Kavanaugh, it is more likely that the undemocratic Supreme Court may overturn Roe. That, of course, would leave individual states to decide whether abortion is legal or not. New Mexico is one of 9 states, and I'll go over those states later in my talk, that still has a pre-Roe abortion ban on the books. If Roe was to be overturned, New Mexico's abortion ban would come into effect. With it coming into effect, that means performing an abortion would be turned into a felony. So the Party for Socialism and Liberation is working on a campaign to repeal this outdated, abhorrent ban. And it is no easy task. It takes a lot of hard work and dedication, As I stated earlier, an important component to this campaign is sending out teams comprised of PSL members and volunteers twice a day in cold temperature to canvass and inform New Mexicans about the ban and the struggle to repeal it. We are collecting petition signatures to back the campaign, organizing student actions on campuses, doing house meetings, town halls, study groups in every corner of the city, and mobilizing working class people statewide. Many folks that I've met on the street doing this work tell me actually that this is the first time that they are learning about the ban, and that they learned about the ban actually through a press conference that the PSL held in early December, which was covered in the Albuquerque Journal. So this campaign is a very grassroots effort and is also a statewide one. Our focus, after all, goes beyond the scope of Albuquerque to all New Mexico, especially rural New Mexico. The campaign is not only about getting this ban repealed once and for all, it is also about abortion access. If Roe versus Wade were to be overturned and this ban were to come into effect, then safe and legal abortions, as I mentioned earlier, would disappear in New Mexico. This means women all over the Southwest, especially poor women, women of color, and especially those in rural communities who already lack basic access to abortion even now, would be affected most of all. Even though New Mexico is among the states with the fewest abortion restrictions, and we want to keep it that way. Restrictions in other states include mandated counseling, deciding to dissuade a woman from obtaining an abortion, a required waiting period before an abortion, and required parental involvement before minor obtains an abortion. So while New Mexico doesn't include these restrictions, New Mexico women in reality still face many challenges in gaining access to abortion and general health care services. In fact, 48% of New Mexico women live in counties with no abortion clinics. Most of these counties are in rural areas, and this reflects a larger national trend. In fact, it is reported that 1 in 5 women in the U.S. would have to travel at least 43 miles to seek abortion care. And we see that here in New Mexico, where women from Arizona and Texas, where there are extreme abortion restrictions in those states, have to travel here to New Mexico for abortion services. And even here in New Mexico, significant parts of the population have to travel over 180 miles to receive clinic services. Of New Mexico's counties, 94% do not have an abortion clinic. It is not surprising then, according to one survey, that 51% of rural New Mexicans say abortion care is not accessible enough. So politicians from both corporate-backed parties have had 50 years to safeguard women's rights by repealing the abortion ban. But both parties have been unwilling or afraid to take action. As a result, the criminalization of abortion is at our doorstep. Therefore, this campaign is very much about getting people into the streets to demand for women's rights and access to abortion and abortion rights. Since the ruling of Roe versus Wade in 1973, abortion rights have been consistently under attack. In the last 10 years, especially, those attacks have only escalated. This past year has already witnessed an enormous escalation in the right-wing misogynistic battle against reproductive rights. From January to March, 37 states introduced measures to restrict abortion or birth control. So many of these laws are, of course, unconstitutional. These right-wing attempts to pass law after law are part of the multi-pronged attack on abortion rights. First, they hope to get to the Supreme Court and overturn Roe versus Wade. Second, in the meantime, they intend to chip away at abortion rights with highly restrictive laws that limit abortion rights under Roe without overturning it outright. Finally, the constant barrage of anti-abortion and anti-birth control legislation is fueling a propaganda campaign to moralize and pathologize women's reproductive rights. The names of the bills themselves use words like fetal pain and heartbeat bill to manipulate people's feelings and about abortion. So while this campaign is very much a local grassroots effort, the political scope really expands beyond the bounds of local politics to a more national political message about abortion rights. Because, after all, there are these abortion bans, and New Mexico is one of 9 states with an abortion ban on the books. And in conjunction to abortion bans being in the books in 9 other states, there's also 4 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Dakota, and South Dakota, that already have laws designed to prohibit most abortions if Roe were to be overturned. Other states that have a pre-Roe ban in the books are Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Louisiana, Rhode Island, Michigan, Mississippi, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Rhode Island. And these have yet to be removed from the books. So there is a lot at stake here. With a misogynistic president and a Supreme Court populated with conservative judges, including Kavanaugh, corporate media has focused on electing pro-choice Democrats, pushing for the blue wave. But this is not the solution to ensure abortion rights are protected. We should remember that the steady chipping away of women's rights over the past 40 years occurred under Republican and Democratic leadership in the White House and the Supreme Court. The erosion of women's rights is often characterized as a right-wing led attack, which it so often is, but we can't ignore how the Democratic Party repeatedly throws women's rights under the bus for short-term electoral gain and compromise. Despite the Democratic Party's reputation as pro-choice, and this stems from their posturing as protectors of reproductive rights, Democratic politicians have proven to be very willing to place more restrictions on abortion access. So let's go over some examples of this. Since 1977, both houses of Congress have upheld the Hyde Amendment, which cut off federal Medicaid funding for poor women with low income access to abortion. In fact, the Hyde Amendment, which bars the federal government from funding abortions through Medicaid, stems from bipartisan efforts to limit abortion access for poor women and women of color. Indeed, it was Democratic President Jimmy Carter who signed into law the Hyde Amendment, and women's reproductive rights didn't see any improvement under any of the subsequent Democratic administrations. When Bill Clinton was governor, despite calling himself pro-choice, he signed a parental notification bill in 1989. Later, as president, Bill Clinton did nothing to protect abortion access for poor women and women of color. Furthermore, under Clinton's administration in the 90s, abortion rights didn't improve at all. Actually, access to abortion dropped. Then later, in 2010, of course, Democratic President Barack Obama issued an executive order ensuring that current restrictions that bar federal funds being used for abortion to stay in place under the Affordable Care Act. So we know that the DNC can't be trusted to protect abortion rights. That is why when the 2019 legislative session opens up on January 15th, Mexican politicians that say they are for women's rights will have a chance to stand with women. Politicians will be held accountable. Those that got elected by saying that they care about women's rights will get a chance to prove it. If they can prove it, they can speak about repealing New Mexico's abortion ban and make the state's laws reflective of the U.S. constitutional right to an abortion. Our biggest challenge is that very few people, as I had mentioned, are aware of New Mexico's abortion ban. Neither of the two big parties has had the courage to talk about it. The PSL aims to change that. We will make sure everyone in the state knows about New Mexico's abortion ban. And the hard work has really paid off, sending out teams every night, even if the temperature is cold, going out talking to hundreds of people about the campaign has meant we've collected 1,600 signatures in this month alone. And despite people not knowing too much about the ban, after talking to our volunteers and petitioners out in the street, are extremely enthusiastic about the campaign. So if everyone in New Mexico knows about the abortion ban, politicians won't be able to weasel out of it anymore. And this is important. If they don't speak up and vote to repeal the abortion ban, everyone will know, and there will be a political cost to pay. Hence why on the opening of the 2019 legislative session, the PSL and others will organize a mass rally at the Roundhouse in Santa Fe to demand that to repeal the ban in 2019, no excuses. The Party for Socialism and Liberation won't stop organizing until the ban is finally repealed. And if you're interested in volunteering for petitioning, feel free to talk to any member here. Thank you. Thank you.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic, or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.